Greetings, productive programmer, and congratulations. You now have a Phoenix LiveView application that supports real-time updating in a JavaScript-like manner, but you actually did not need to write any JavaScript. You simply wrote the event handler, and you were able to handle the event on this button click and update this button in real time. But you may be interested, well, how do you actually do a traditional form in Phoenix LiveView? And so that's what this lesson is going to dive into. I'm going to show you how forms work in Phoenix LiveView, and you'll get a really good idea. Now, if you've used Pheonix before, you'll see that the new form structure in Phoenix 1.7 is quite different. And if you're new to Phoenix 1.7, then this is a good fresh start and you won't have to worry about the old way of doing things. So in Phoenix LiveView, the way that we can do this is we can set up a form here, and we will set up a simple form using the dot syntax that we saw before. And I'm going to create a closing tag for this simple form. Make sure your / always goes before the dots. And inside of this simple form, we can set up an input field also using the dot notation. So dot input, and this will be a self-closing tag. So our input field will be self-closing, and we can set this up to have an initial value. Let's set that to 5. Now our form is not going to work initially, but I'm going to show you that this form structure is fairly similar to regular HTML. So before I add in all of the connecting code, I just want to show you how this is very similar to HTML structure. So I'm just copying and pasting this button we had before, but we don't need this click event. This click event is for the add event, which will trigger the add event handler over here. And we don't want that because this form is going to be completely separate from our add button. And I haven't hit save yet, so that's why you're not seeing anything on the screen. And this is going to say add more. Now I am going to hit save here. And if I come back here, we should see this break. And this breaks, it says this key 4 is not found. So when you define your forms, you actually need to define additional properties. So basically, in order for our simple form here to function, we need to mount a form. So what I'm going to do inside of where we mount our socket is I'm going to mount a form. So I'm going to add as an additional parameter here that we assign to the socket a form. And I'm going to do that by calling the toForm function. Now, if I do this off the bat, it's going to throw an error, because the toForm actually requires some parameters to be entered here in order for this to function. So I'm going to add some empty parameters. So to start off our discussion, I'm not going to pass any parameters to our form, but in a couple minutes, I'll add some parameters to this form so that it makes more sense. So I'm just going to limit the amount of new topics so that I'm not overwhelming you. So you can see, again, the forms are very similar to regular HTML structure. And in order for this to work, we are going to tie this form that we've just mounted to the socket to this simple form. And the way we do that, as we saw, there was an error that said the key 4 could not be found. So what we're going to do is we're going to use that keyword here. So we're going to type 4, and we're going to set this equal to the form that we just created. And since this is in the socket, and we know that the socket, anything inside the socket assigns can be accessed with this app parameter, we can now access this using the app parameter form. And this will make our simple form associated with the form that we've mounted to our socket. So if we come back here and we refresh this, we're still going to see that we get an error. It says that the name is not found. And so what it's looking for here is it's looking for something to connect this form's input field. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say that this input field needs to be a field that's going to equal, and we can set this to be our form. And we need to give this form's input field a name. So I'm going to name this add_amount. And then if I save that, we should see that this now should render for us. And it does. And the default value that we set inside of our form here is being rendered out to the form. So now we can try to save this and see what kind of error we get, because currently we don't have any event handler similar to how our add button works. So our add button, if we click it, it has an event handler, but if we click add more here, there's no event handler, so nothing happens. Our application does not break permanently, but nothing functions. If we come to the command line, we'll see that our application did not break and that the add amount parameter is passing 5 here. So all we need to do now is just handle this event, because it is being triggered, but it is not functioning. And so what we want to do is we want to set up an event handler just like we have the add event handler. And we want this to be an event handler for the form submission. So Pheonix, just like we have Pheonix click, there is also a Pheonix submit. So we can do Pheonix-submit, and then we can handle the submit event. And we'll call this submit event adding more. And now when we submit our form, we can have an event handler just like this one. So I'll copy and paste this one as a start-in code, and I'll rename the handle event adding_more. And since we are passing some parameters here, in this case our parameters are add amount, we're going to need to capture those add amount parameters that are being passed. So what I can do is I can use the terminal here as I can copy and paste the code that's on the terminal here, because that's going to be the way that our parameters are structured. So we're going to capture the add amount, and in order to capture the value that we want, we can just pattern match here. So we'll make this a variable called the added amount. And then we are going to use this to update the number that we have mounted in our socket. So that way it will display up here next to the add button. And so now we can assign to the socket, and instead of updating by 1, we'll update by the added amount. So let's save that and come back to our form, and let's test to see if this is working. So I'll refresh the page. The default value is still 5. If I hit add more, looks like we get an error. So let's go back and let's check the code. It says that there's bad arithmetic, and that's because we are currently setting this to be a string here in our input, and it expects a number. So just like regular HTML forms, strings are stored inside of the values of input fields, and so you'll always need to convert these values into an integer if you're expecting a number, otherwise they'll be a string. And we can't add a string to our number because it is an integer. So what we can do is we can use some very simple Elixir code to parse this integer. So the added amount integer, we're going to parse that to be an integer. And the way that we can do that is we can call integer parse, and we can pass that in here to our integer parse. Now it shows that when it returns a value, it's going to return the integer as well as the remainder. So we need to make sure that we capture just the amount that we want to add by. So again, if we hover over this function, you'll see that it returns an integer as well as a remainder. And it's going to put that inside of a simple mapping like this. So we can capture those values by pattern matching. So this is going to be the number, and then this is going to be the remainder, but we could just put this as an underscore since we're not going to use it. And that's the way that we can ignore anything that we're not going to use. It's currently all turning yellow because it's saying that number is unused. So we're just going to use that number, and we're going to use it where we are adding it to our socket number. Now, there will be no confusion here because the number inside of our socket is under socket assigns, and the value that we've just mapped here is just a variable directly named number. So there won't be any conflict here with the naming that structure that we have. But if that's confusing, you could always name this something else other than a keyword. So this could be something else, and then you could use something else here. But I'm just going to call mine number because that makes the most sense. All right, so let's go back to our form and let's see if that's functioning now. We can go ahead and we can click add more, and now it adds by 5. If I enter 3 and I try to add it to 10, I should get 13. I click add, we get 13. It resets the value to the default value that we have hard coded here. Now traditionally with Phoenix LiveView, you don't want to hard code values here. So what we can do is we can actually pass a value into here, and that's where we're going to return to that discussion about the form parameters. So there's actually 2 ways to do this. If you need to use something inside of your sockets assign, you can use that. So I'll show you 2 ways that you can pass a default value here to our input field. The first one would be to inside of where we mount our socket when this page loads, is we could add it here, and we can have this called adding amount default. Again, you probably won't use as descriptive names as me. The purpose is just to be very descriptive in your learning process so you understand what this field is referring to. So the add an amount default, I'll set this to a unique value. Before we were using 5, so I'm going to use something like 7 or 8. That way you'll know that this is different. So I'm going to take add an amount default, copy that, and I'm going to put that right here where this value is. Now, if you want to put something inside of a form, as you can see, I've been using this bracket syntax. So anytime you're assigning something inside of a form, you do equal, and then you use the brackets, and then you're able to refer to Elixir variables inside of those brackets. So here I'm going to use the @ syntax. Again, that's shorthand to access everything inside the sockets assigns. So I'm going to grab the value for the add an amount default, and I'm going to put that here in our value. So now when we go back to our page, we should see that 8 gets loaded here. And it does, and that still functions just like it did before, and we can overwrite the default value should we need to. Now, the other way to do this, and what's new with Phoenix LiveView now, and particularly Phoenix 1.7, is the way that we use the forms. Since we implement this toForm structure and we can pass parameters directly here into the toForm, what we can do is we can actually make this a parameter specifically to the form. So instead of having something assigned to our socket that could be used in different places, if we have something that is just particularly used inside of the form and we want to clean up our code and keep it organized, we can take this, and what I'll do is I'll move this out of here so that it's not available inside of the sockets assigned directly. And I'm going to put that inside of our form. So I'm going to put that here. And now if we want to access this code, we can come here and we can, if we go back to our code, we'll see this doesn't function. It says that the added amount default is not found because it's trying to look for it directly inside of these sockets assigned. Since this is now inside of our form, we're going to do @form.params. And then we can access this added amount default. And so if we come back to our page, this will function again. Let me go ahead and just change this to another unique value so that it's very clear. So we'll use 7 now. Come back to our page. It loads with 7. We can click add more and it gets updated here. We can change this to be 2 and it will add up correctly. And so everything is functioning just like it did before, and our code has been cleaned up so that way this parameter is specific just to our form. So this way our default value is only being used inside of our form here. So congratulations, you actually just learned a tremendous amount about Phoenix 1.7 and Phoenix LiveView and how you can support fields inside of forms, and you can make those forms handle their submit events. So here we handle a Pheonix submit event, and we are able to capture that. And you even learned a little bit of Elixir, how to parse a variable. And again, that grabs the number as well as the remainder. So we just pattern matched here and grabbed just the number, and we added that to the number that we have assigned to our socket. We also learned how to store parameters inside of our form to keep our code nice and clean and organized. So congratulations, we now have our form completely functional. Now there are a couple of things that you may have noticed. If we try to backspace here and we try to submit a form that's empty, we'll actually still get an error. So in the next lesson, we're going to learn how to clean that up. How come when we don't have anything entered here and we click add more, we get an error? Well, the reason is that when we submit that form without a value, it's still going to try to parse this value here. And since we are passing an empty string, it can't parse that. So we're getting an error down here. And another thing that we're going to clean up in the next lesson is if we wanted to enter the number 3 here and add it, what if we wanted it to save the last value that was submitted in form? So when I click add more here, it automatically sets it back to the default 7. And now how can we actually have that be updated so that way we can have it store the value such as 3, and when we click add more, it'll still say 3 here after we submit. So in the next lesson, we're going to learn how to fix those 2 use cases, whether you enter an empty string or you enter a value that you want to be stored by default. All right, so I'll see you over in the next lesson where we continue this discussion and we do a little bit of form cleanup here. So I'll see you over in the next lesson.